in theory, all that's really happened is that, in addition to normal sort of metrics, right, what you've had is like really, really, theoretically, it will append certain criteria, like do you recycle and stuff like this. Like, are you driving your car on the sidewalk?
It's like the Great Reset here in the West, taking these ecological and social values into account so that we can have stakeholders and not just stockholders.
Well, you might, yeah. I mean, you can be critical of it. Like, if you want to criticize it on that level, it's fine.
No, I'm exposing my extreme right wing paranoia. Go on.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. All right, you got your iced tea? That's a bottle of tea you've got there.
Let's get her going.
All right. So, Conrad Hamilton, you are a philosopher. Are you a lecturer already? Are you teaching?
I teach in a language department in Paris.
Okay, so there you go.
I just go on and on about whatever, like Chinese Marxism or
and you teach them English.
Deleuze and Guattari on finance capital or whatever, and then at the end of the year, the students are given these automatic exams, but like spot the dog or whatever, so they just try to suffer through my, interminable, stupid lectures. And then at the end, just hopefully just do the dumb English exam and get it over with. Right.
What they're trying to do is listen to you and learn to understand what you're saying, basically. Right.
Yeah. Hopefully some smidgen of it is retained, because I'm not always the best at, but one thing you do get is when you're teaching French students, you get extremely theatrical, because you just have to do anything. Like, I'm never going to be the same. I've done this so much. I'm never going to be the same as a lecture. So you go in the room, right? You go like full Matthew McConaughey, like, all right. You become like a fucking clown, because you're just trying to get people to actually, pay attention to what you're saying. Right. So it's kind of quite theatrical too.
Right. Okay. So you have many credentials. You are an accomplished scholar and a fine man. But around Sublation, you're known as our contemporary Stalinist, your in-house Stalinist.
I like how this title has just been thrust on me. I think that's
so, which we have we're developing a relationship with a contemporary anarchist as well. So maybe we can get the two of you in a room sometime, and at the end, both of these deviations will be dealt with. Well, you had a response to when Chris Cutrone was on the Sublation magazine stream with Ashley and I, and specifically, we want to talk about what constitutes or what counts as fascism, and whether or not it's fair to hurl that epithet at the contemporary Chinese state, and also to what degree is there a coherent notion of fascism on the left today, whether Chris Cutrone has one, whether you have one, whether I have one. I'll take the easy Socratic position of saying, I don't know what this is. You know much more than I do. Please explain, what is fascism?
Yeah, it's a big one to lead in on. Well, again, there has been a certain lack of clarity that's plagued the left in this respect. But one thing I think can be helpful is to listen to what people say about themselves, right? Because I think people often, to a surprising degree, sometimes we take this for granted, right? You can get into this kind of hermeneutics of suspicion and ignore how clear people are about stating their own purposes. One of the most, of course, destructive, probably the most destructive political figure of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler, he wrote a book. He said what he was going to do, right? And people said, well, no, that'll never happen. Of course, it kind of did. But on a milder scale, even someone like Donald Trump, right? A lot of people were saying, oh well, his his actions will never match up to what he's saying, right? And I guess the jury's out as to what degree they did, but what's clear is that there was a consistency in tone in terms of his presidency and in terms of his campaigning. So I think it can be good. Or even what, like Bill Cosby making jokes about date rape, right? That's like, listen to women. What about listen to men, right? There you go.
From age 11 on up to death, we will still be searching for Spanish fly.
They say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
There was a quote by Carl Schmidt, I think, that was really good about this. That I still think, if people ask me what fascism is, it'd be really helpful. Right. And Schmidt, he says that, and I don't know if fascism is the exact word he uses, but he says that, National Socialism or our kind of system, our thing, like Cosa Nostra, our thing, right? It comes into being at such a point as, society ceases being a society of atomic liberal individuals, right? In other words, at such a point as the organization of the left, right, and the strength of labor becomes so powerful that it chafes against, right, or exploits, if you will, right, that individualistic structure and the rights which it bequeaths. And it's at that point where society, to defend itself against this existential threat, right, it has to mobilize in a way that is beyond the individual. Right, they uses super individual forces, like government, military, police, in order to mitigate against that. Right. So to me, I think that's one of the best. I mean, it's a bit vague, obviously, right, and that can mean different things. But I think as a very general outline, I think that can be very helpful.
Okay, so let me see if I understand what you're saying. For something to be fascist, the first, like, most essential aspect of a fascist society is one in which the individual, the liberal bourgeois individual, the free subject, is no longer either the primary force in society and nor a protected category in society.
Not that it's not a protected category. In fact, more that the very nature of its protection is that the protection of the individual becomes cover for the organization of the left, right? The uninhibited organization of the left in a way that threatens to challenge the status quo. Because workers' organizations are not individuals, right? Labor unions, communist parties, socialist parties, and so on. These aren't individuals. They're collective organizations that have the power to transform society, right? So it's at that point where, you have to kind of, the idea, according to Schmidt, you have to kind of upend the table, right? And you have to develop a reactionary form of collective organization. Again, I don't think he uses the adjective reactionary, but you get my point. You have to develop a reactionary form of collective organization capable of preventing that, right? So mass meets mass, right?
So what was it that Schmidt was trying to protect against? What was it about the left, and what distinguished the left from the right in Schmidt's understanding? How do we? I mean, because it seems to be both the fascists and the communists in this story are going beyond the rights of individuals and trying to form some sort of collective project and put the rights of this collective ahead of the rights of individuals in order to upend the status quo on both the right and the left, right? So both are, in that sense, fascist. If that's if we're using that as a definition of fascism.
Well, no, I'm not. Again, what I would characterize as fascism is what he's describing the reaction to that as being, right?
Okay, all right. So, but the reaction to that, so fascism is when you try to stop the supersession of liberal bourgeois rights in the name of socialism or on the left, fascist.
But paradoxically have to supersede it in order to,
by creating your own version of the same thing.
By creating a collective, mass form.
Right.
A reactionary mass form, yeah.
So what is the difference between a fascist mass form or a collectivization along fascist lines and a collectivization along socialist lines?
Well, I mean, I think that, and we could get into talking about Schmidt's period. I mean, I think it's pretty well established that, his view of sort of the sovereign as the one who decides in the last instance is intimately, bound up with Hitler's use and abuse of emergency powers, right, in Germany in the 1930s, right? He was sort of the crown jurist of the Third Reich. But I think that, again, if we're looking at this, I think that what really separates the fascist organization, again, is that it's something that emerges contra the organization of the working class, right? And contra the political projects of the working class. Now, in some contexts, it might be a response to different kinds of progressive class formations, right? Potentially involving peasants and this kind of thing. But to sort of simplify, right? We could say that it emerges as a reaction to the working class. And, I think that traditionally, right, you would say that there's a very, very strong link with the petit bourgeois, right? So that, a lot of the people who supported Nazism, for example, they were not, they had some urban workers. I mean, Trotsky observes that, for example, but that it was more, small shop owners in the countryside. People would sort of be part of the middle class and so on. Right. So I think that there's a difference in class composition in that way and an interest because, obviously a socialist government or a communist government may have to contend with the existence of capital globally. Right. But, rather unambiguously, right, the goal of fascism is also to preserve capitalism. Right. There can be perhaps there can be a similar resort to forms of corporatism on both sides. But I think you can see that there's a very different, ideological trajectory that underpins those. Right.
So did Schmidt talk about the preservation of capitalism per se? And was that the aim of the fascists then it sounds to me like when you have a mass organization that goes beyond liberal bourgeois individualism on the right, what distinguishes it from the left-wing version is whether or not the people who are organizing are workers or not. If they're workers, then it's on the left, and if they're not workers, then it's on the right. It's not
a completely simple identity question. Tendentially, I think that's what it is, right? Mm-hmm. But again, there have been socialist agendas, right, that have been supported by coalitions that aren't predominantly comprised of workers, right? Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of China or something coming to mind, right. And they did fight against, both the Japanese who were fascist, as well as the nationalists. Right, and Chiang Kai-shek's son, of course, served in the Wehrmacht right before he came over to fight the Japanese. So I'm not saying the Chinese nationalists were fascists, but they had some of those elements. So I don't want to say that it's strictly speaking a question of workers, but I think tendentially that's the pattern we tend to see in terms of the demographic that's advancing that political agenda. Right.
So it's not so you could have a workers' organization that was run by the ultimate sovereign, as long as that sovereign was working and had his power and authority or her power and authority in the name of the working class, and whether or not he or she was working class, it would be a left-wing formation.
Obviously, this is a very, very This is a very interesting question, right?
I just want to remind you, I am playing Socrates here. This is all I'm doing is asking you the questions that come up from your answers. I don't have a vision in mind one's developing maybe, but
I think that, as Engels used to say, the proof is in the pudding, right? And so, if you're dealing with, a very inchoate coalition, especially in countries which don't have rich traditions of political democracy and this kind of thing, right? If it's a violent class conflict, I don't think it's surprising for power to become centralized in the hands of certain people or certain committees, right? I don't think that's ever good. I don't think it's a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. I think it happens, it's always indicative of a certain kind of failure, but I think we can see that it happens, right? But, I don't think that, insofar as the causes being championed and the results being achieved, right, by said group, right, are consonant with the agenda of socialism and with the demands of those social classes, then I think that one has to say that, well, in a way, there is a kind of de facto democracy which exists within that, because there is an effective representative function being executed, right? Now, if the agenda or if the policies were to diverge wildly from that, then we could speculate about it being, some sort of truly perverse kind of formation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that that consistency, right, to carry out an ideological agenda, right, for the workers or for socialism, right. I think it does attest to a certain kind of integrity within the form of political organization we're discussing. Yeah.
Right. So, Hitler, he was a representative of
Hitler.
Hitler. I remember Hitler. You remember Hitler? I found out recently. I did a little reading, and it turns out he was a real jerk. But
Wow.
I don't like that guy at all. Yeah.
Just don't. Do you wear? I know the Nixon shirt is ironic. Just don't start wearing a Hitler shirt. Ironically,
No, I'm not going to
push
wear
it too far.
No, I'll just get a Kanye shirt. Hitler was a jerk, but he also, I think, claimed to be a representative of all of the classes in society and the will of the nation, right? Unlike a divine king who represented some divine external authority. Yeah. Hitler's authority did come from the people, ultimately, right?
Yeah.
So he represented the will of the people, the true people, the master race, I guess, in Germany. So how do we distinguish between? Is it just the difference between representing all of the people and as an undifferentiated mass, acceptably differentiated along ethnic lines, as opposed to representing strictly the working class when you have that position of the sovereign authority that distinguishes between left and right sovereigns?
I mean, just about any sovereign claims to represent all of the people, right? Like, this is pretty universal,
I don't think Mao didn't, right? I mean, he was sort of the sovereign, and he didn't represent all the will of all the people. He represented the will of the proletariat revolution.
That would be another. But Mao's quite sui generis. But I mean, you can argue that, as much
Stalin's the same way. Stalin did not represent the will of all the people. There were problems within the people, and he represented the working class, the revolution.
But if you actually look at like their various speeches, like you'll find claims being made with respect to a general representative function, regardless of what people are doing, which get, and you'll find other claims too. But this kind of gets me to my point, right? Which is that, it wouldn't be so much a matter of what someone says, right? I mean, it's easy enough to say, well, I represent all people, right? Mm-hmm. You really have to look at what people do. I mean, so if you look at a state like Nazi Germany, if you look at the repression of organized labor, if you look at, the massive profits that were engendered on that basis, right, by people close to the regime, right, if you look at the relentless ethnic oppressions, if you look at the stamping out of the left, right, and I think relentless ethnic oppressions is an understatement, of course, given what we know about that period. If you look at, the invasion of other nations without regard in the least for international law, right, let alone having some kind of emancipatory agenda. I think that, these are things that really, really contravene, right, any kind of progressive agenda. But I mean, that just goes back to what the nature of fascism is and what its class base originates in. Right? Now,
you said progressive agenda, which is interesting, is because the progressivist movement has been, in the United States anyway, was sort of opposed to socialism. It was a way in which the state could ameliorate or mitigate the troubles within a capitalist society without having to overturn capitalism, without having a socialist project take hold. So would the progressives working on a collective level through the state to suppress socialism be fascist?
So here's really where we get, I think, to the crux of what we want to discuss.
Yeah.
Right. Because I listened to Chris Cutrone the other day, and it was kind of weird. Like, so Katrone, he seemed to, on one hand, he has this sort of very platypus thesis that's influenced by, Pistone and so on, where he'll say, well, everything is kind of, any kind of corporatism that's executed by the state, right? He was saying that he was implying sort of this is all fascism, right? And then on the other hand, he turns around and says, well, China, the CCP is maybe the last fascist state, right? But then in other debates we've had with him, like he'll claim like neoliberalism is not a hard rupture with, Keynesian dirigism, right? Because the state's still very involved in the organization of the economy. So I don't really know, right? Is it the case that every modern government, up to and including neoliberal governments, is fascist? Or is it the case that China is the last standing representative of this? I mean, I think there are some things in his thought that would be good for him to clarify. But I also think that it's kind of interesting. Like there was one part of, and I'm actually gonna. It's funny because you call me the contemporary Stalinist, but I'm actually going to defend Trotsky a little bit here because I am eclectic, But at one point, Katrone, he said, well, we should take seriously the fact that in the early part of the 20th century, social democracy or dirigism was what, Marxists called fascism, right? And then he gives the example of, Roosevelt being referred to as fascist when he ran for the U.S. election, and his opponent being referred to as social fascist, I think. And this is actually really interesting, right? Because, of course, Platypus, I guess, is supposed to be like this avowedly anti-Stalinist organization, this like study of Trotsky's thought. But like I was listening to that, and I think like you can correct me if I'm wrong, or he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what he's talking about is the Stalinist thesis of social fascism. This was a thesis that was developed and propagated by Stalin in this time, partly because of the competition, right, or the threat that was felt to be posed. Right,
well, I would say that Stalinist critique of the Social Democrats had, the tricky thing with eminent critique is that you often start by agreeing with your opponent, right? So I would say that was probably in many ways correct. The question for me is to what degree was Stalinism itself markedly different from FDR's America or Mussolini's Italy. The Postone view is that the Fordist period imposed similar structures around the world on many different nations in many different forms with different ideological justifications, and that that looking at the similarities between FDR's America and Mussolini's Italy is justified.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly understand, like, and we've talked about this before, like the idea of like the mediation of society by abstract labor. I feel that it elides very, very significant differences in terms of public and private capital and like overall political trajectory. Dear God, even like the position of the working class, right? It's like if you look at places like, Russia and China, at times the working class enjoyed enormous amounts of power, right? Just like, in China, right, in the 70s, just like fuck off from work for like a week because your wife's sick, right? Like whatever, just like show up and read the paper for an hour, very different situation. So I just think you can't sweep all those differences under the rug. I mean, that's my position on that. But what I want to say about this thing is it's interesting that Katrone goes toward this Stalinist line, right, of social fascism, right? The idea that all corporatism, all sort of class collusion is automatically fascist. And this to me is it's a really good example of, and I'm not saying there's not like a semblance of truth. Like, of course you can say, well, there's some kind of corporatist, organization, which is similar. But like, I think in reality, people are capable of differentiating these things. Like, to me, it's a really good example of like theory brain, right? Or I guess what Mao used to call book worship, right? Because, if you look at a regime that basically attempts to placate the left, right? Having some kind of cooperation with labor unions, left-wing organizations, potentially bringing them into government in some capacity, passing crucial reforms, right, to, increase the value of labor, social insurance and so on, right? We can say that maybe in the last instance that is, contrary to the, maybe you can argue, well, this obstructs the construction of socialism. But whether it does or whether it doesn't, most people are capable of differentiating between that and like the violent oppression of the left, right? Like those are just different responses to that,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
So along these lines, right, like Trotsky actually wrote about this, right? And Trotsky actually, strongly disagreed, right, with the thesis of social fascism, right? He saw that there was potentially a need to collaborate, right, between communists and social democrats to stave off the fascist threat, right? And he very, very clearly references, police and military processes of oppression, right, as being central to the identity of what fascism is, right?
Mhm.
And I think that, I think even at, it's well known, I think that it was the German Communist Party that was the most vehement, right, kind of in the advancement of the thesis of social fascism, and that impeded forms of collaboration that might have stopped the rise of Hitler, right? So it's sort of infamous in that way. But even at the time, I mean, that thesis really struggled for credibility because, again, if you look at this stuff in the most basic way, right, it's like those aren't the same thing, right? I mean, like I think Lenin, there's something Lenin likes to say sometimes, right, where he's like, he who says too much says nothing at all. Right? Like, if you're just going to make that any kind of corporatist organization, well, what are we left with really to talk about fascism, right? And that's why it kind of puzzled me because on one hand, Katrone goes toward this what I consider to be quite a Stalinist and incorrect definition, though to be fair, Moscow does drop it, at such time as it becomes expedient to drop a few years later. But Katrone goes toward this very expansive definition of what fascism would be, right? Dirigist corporatism. But then at the same time, right, describing the Chinese Communist Party as the last fascist state, right? Which is like a really, really peculiar statement. But, particularly when, we're in a world where we have all different kinds of parties like, BJP in India, or parties like, the National Front in France, which are parties, right? Even if they don't govern, he said party. Right, which are either in power or vying for power, right, and have an explicitly reactionary character, and all advocate, let's say, more open forms of repression toward the left.
So one of the things that we're talking about that I'm hearing now is that the degree to which the state can be controlled or determined by civil society, by the voters, is maybe the degree to which you're escaping from the clutches of fascism. In a fascist state, there is no electoral mechanism, in fact, that can dislodge the power of the current state ideology, apparatus, administration, so on.
I mean, I think that the reality is that when it comes to this, there can be very, very fascistic governments which manifest in the context of some form of electoral transparency existing, right? Like I said about the United States, but I think that if you look at what Schmidt was saying, right, about the need to combat sort of left organization, I think that usually in order to achieve the support necessary to actually dispel with democracy itself, right, you have to be able to rationalize in terms of the threat being prominent enough, right? So I think one of the issues like we have in the United States is like, it's not lost on me that, Trump coming to power, right, and this sort of right authoritarianism has strengthened itself in a time where there has been, a certain kind of resistance in the United States, right? Whether it's, Occupy or whether it's, we see the Sanders movement kind of coalescing at the same time, right? And these are in many ways, I mean, with the Sanders thing, for example, this is the most organized the American left has been since the Great Depression, right? So that's significant. But at the same time, like, it's not the same as Germany and the Weimar Republic, right? In terms of like the existential threat, right? Like of a communist revolution happening any day, right? So I think it's hard to actually, because that was the thing, right? Like if you look at a place like Germany or you look at a place like Italy with Mussolini, they were able to actively fascist groups were able to actively attract the support of the bourgeois because they were able to persuade them, look, you have to give us power, right? Because if you don't support this authoritarian agenda, then the left's going to take power, right? The communists and the socialists are going to take power, right? And I think in America, it's been harder to make that case, right? Which explains, how relatively slow, segments of the American bourgeois. I mean, some have, right? We see like Elon Musk now is like a fan of Trump. Some of them are coming around to it. It seems to be getting stronger. But we do see that, and it seems to be getting stronger as America itself becomes more destabilized, right? But we do see that it's been a comparatively slow process, right? That actual gestation. And I think it just, so I think in a way, and interestingly, I think that the limits of the left, in a certain way, are also, the limits of the far right, right? That is to say that, if we were actually more threatening, then I think it would be much easier to make that case, right, for the consolidation of power.
So what was it that that Schmidt saw the left doing that required the establishment to go beyond liberal democracy in order to defend against it? What was the Schmidt's conception of the left and the left's project?
Well, I'm not a Schmidt scholar, but again, my understanding of it is that he saw them as kind of cheating, right? He saw them as kind of breaking the rules, right, of liberal democracy, right? Because, and it's really suggestive to talk about, organized labor in this way, right? Because if you have just a bunch of individualized laborers, right, as we know very well, and as the experience of post-Fordism has been instructive in this way, it's very, very hard, right, without collective organization to actually improve your working conditions, right? So under those conditions, if we just look at the front of organized labor, right, it's relatively easy for capitalist companies to, continue to make high profits and exploit labor and all this, right? But when workers actually get together and resist that collectively, right, I mean, that challenge can become significant enough, right, and consider the problems that Weimar Germany was facing in the 20s.
Why was that considered cheating?
Well, it's considered cheating. It's considered cheating because, well, it may be legal to form these organizations. The idea is that it goes against, the notion of like the atomized worker, right? Negotiating for their wages.
But doesn't
right? Or the individual voting?
Wouldn't the enfranchisement of voters likewise go against this idea of the atomized worker? Or isn't even the taxation and the formation of a state, and wouldn't municipal projects also go against this idea of the atomized? I mean, in a sense,
and then
isn't the capitalist firm, a collectivization of work, and going beyond just the atomized worker only producing? I mean, we'd all have to be Robinson Crusoe living on an island, growing our own food, and we wouldn't have a servant either. We'd, to really live up to the Schmittian ideal of everyone just being completely independent. So it seems to me that the idea of collective power is like already built into liberal democracy. It's not.
Well, yeah, of course, Doug. It's like, it's like this, it's an interesting definition, I find, because it's schematic and it can help us understand, what fascism is. But of course, if we subject this to the test of reality, it's like, this whole thing about, like atomized individuals, right? Like, does that include women who are like working in the home and like still couldn't vote in many jurisdictions, right? Or like,
they're more atomized than anyone. They live out in the suburbs.
Or maybe less in a way too, right? Vis-a-vis in facing the liberal system as wage workers, right? In a way, like they're not facing the liberal system as wage workers in that way. So it's a different kind of thing.
They don't have the wage worker. They don't have the wage relationship in order that they can collectively organize around.
Or
the only way they organize is as opposed to their husbands. Is they have feminism to organize against the system. But go on. I mean, back in the day, obviously now there are many women who are wage workers, but most or the majority.
So obviously Schmidt's definition itself, I guess what I'm getting at, right, to try to get it, more clearly, Schmidt's definition itself hinges on this sort of, I think myth of, and it's not to say that there isn't like a kernel of truth in it, but it hinges on this myth of, early capitalism being something that's just kind of like, harmonious, right? In which just a society of individuals, we're all good. We're all just doing our own thing, right? Everything works.
What Proudhon wanted to achieve the Schmidt thought had already been accomplished, and everything that was wrong was some infringement from an alien force upon a system that was already functioning. Is that?
Well, I think he was also, but I think that, part of the paradox of Schmidt's thought, is it's not that in the context of emergency, the role of the sovereign may have to become more emphatic, but he also, I mean, he also did understand that there always is a hard authoritarian kernel of power that exists, right? So I think to try to interpret it a little more sympathetically, we would say that what he's saying is that, there was this society of individuals interacting that way, right? That there was a hard kernel of power, but that didn't have to show its face, so to speak, in the same way, right? Because it hadn't yet had to confront the organization of the left.
Okay, so we've been talking for really officially talking for just around 40 minutes, a little less, and I feel like in the next 5 minutes, I want to close off the first half of our conversation. So before we do, I want to give you an opportunity to directly express your critique of Catrone's definition of fascism, and then I want to maybe respond to it, and then we can talk about something to the side of it, but still on the same topic, a little bit more in a more freewheeling fashion. And I will drop my Socrates Act for the second half. So, because all I've been doing is trying to push you for solid definitions the whole time, and so, go ahead. And what is your, in a few sentences, what is your critique of Catrone's definition of fascism?
Well, I mean, my critique of it is that, and this isn't even something that Postone says, right? Because his real claim, right, is that, the social mediation of labor, abstract labor, what we're talking about, this is like capitalism. But I think that, when it comes to Katrone, and I've said this before, I think the basic problem here, and again, going back to Trotsky's critique of social fascism, which is what I'm going to draw on here, is that, fascism is something that emerges or is responsive to, progressive developments within a society, right? And that, there's a sense in which it's violently hostile or repressive toward those, right? It is not a form of, it's not about placating or appeasing or working with those elements of society. Right. And I think that, again, if you align yourself with that definition, things just become so hazy in general. Right. And then you get in the situation where you're calling the Chinese Communist Party fascist. Right. Which is something else we should talk about.
Okay. So I would say to respond to that, I would say that what Katrone was trying to point to was that when you begin to use the state as a mechanism to mediate and placate and overcome the contradictions that arise from capitalist society, rather than attempt to create the dictatorship of the proletariat to overcome those contradictions, you are already on the road towards what we'll call fascism, because you will always rely on the authority and the mandate on violence within the state, the exclusive mandate on violence the state has, to overcome contradictions in the final analysis. Now, you can do that to greater or lesser degrees, but even the Nazis were working with the people, if the people were, sufficiently and narrowly defined, right? There were aspects of what the Nazis were doing that was meant to help everyday people overcome problems in their lives. To put it in a more immediate sense, and one I know a little bit better, in the 90s, the spending on the police and the increasingly draconian and extreme jail sentences or prison sentences that were given to specifically the black population in America, was something that not only was meant to help white Americans with their problems around crime, but also was supported by a strata and a majority strata within the black population. So it's not so much as to whether or not the state is opposing the people or working with the people, I think, but rather it's how the problems are trying to be solved. And that defines the difference between a fascist or Bonapartist or statist solution.
Okay, because you just threw out 3 words and you just scrambled up like the whole 20th century into fascism. But don't you think there's a risk to this? Like what you're doing, like when you say like Bonapartism, because that is like one thing that Katrone was right about, right, is that and maybe he could have dwelt a bit more upon the degree to which Lenin himself was actually an influence on this, because Lenin's an influence on Hitler, but also on Roosevelt indirectly in terms of the kind of Derechism coming out of war communism.
What is the big risk that I'm taking?
Well, the big risk is that you're actually, you're putting yourself in a position where, you're describing like 20th century politics, tout court, right? In governments that have very, very diverse kinds of class compositions, and very, very different policies toward the left. And you're just calling them all fascist. Right. And like,
what am I risking there? We were not going to have an actual definition of fascism if you do that. Right. We're not going to have one that's going to be specifically able to be applied towards what I'm describing. Why not? We can have a definition of the ocean, and then every variety of fish in the ocean is still swimming in the ocean. Okay, I don't see why we can't have a definition of fascism that would include most of the political structures in the second half of the 20th century, let's say, as fascist, and not have that definition be adequate. I mean, you're just assuming.
Aristotle over here.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.